Alistair hadn't visited the campsite in 5 years, not since the official report declared his sister Brenna was lost to the unforgiving wilderness. They said she was an inexperienced hiker who wandered off trail, a tragic but simple accident. But Alistair knew Brenna, and she was anything but careless. Today, a fisherman's call about a mud-caked book found by the river changes everything, because the book is a local sheriff's department manual, and the notes scribbled in the margins are in his sister's unmistakable handwriting. What follows is a story about how a single, forgotten object can unravel a lie that has held a family and a town captive for years. It makes you wonder what truths might be lying just beneath the surface, waiting for the right person to come looking. The phone call had felt like a punch to the gut. It was Deputy Miller, a man young enough to have been in high school when Brenna vanished. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as if he knew he was ripping a 5-year-old wound wide open. He'd explained that a fly fisherman snagged his line on something downriver from the North Ridge trailhead. When he'd pulled it free, it was a book, sealed in a Ziploc bag that had mostly disintegrated, but had done just enough to preserve its contents from turning into pulp. Alistair had agreed to come down to the station, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Now sitting in a sterile interview room, the book lay on the metal table between him and the deputy. The yellow cover was stained brown with river mud, the proud sheriff's department seal barely visible. Alistair recognized it instantly. It was the book Brenna had been reading in the last photo he had of her, the one she'd taken of herself on her phone, smiling peacefully in her hammock at the campsite just hours before she disappeared. He had spent countless nights staring at that photo, memorizing the gentle curve of her smile, the dappled sunlight on her face, and the bright yellow corner of that book. Deputy Miller slid a pair of nitrile gloves across the table. "We'd just like you to confirm the handwriting, Mr. Calloway. For the record." Alistair pulled on the gloves, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the stiff, warped cover. The pages were damp and smelled of earth and decay, but the ink, a specific fine-point black pen Brenna always used, had held. Her handwriting was everywhere. It filled the margins, circled paragraphs, and underlined sentences with sharp, angry strokes. This wasn't the book of a casual reader. This was the work of an investigator. "That's her," Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "That's Brenna's writing." His eyes scanned the pages. They weren't random jottings. They were notes, cross-references to dates and public records. One phrase was circled on 3 different pages, Blackwood Creek Development, and next to a section on land use jurisdiction, a single name was written with a question mark. Sheriff Coleman? Sheriff Marcus Coleman, the man who had personally led the search for Brenna, the man who had sat with Alistair and his parents, his expression a mask of solemn sympathy, and told them they'd done everything they could, the man who had closed the case, ruling it a tragic accident. A cold dread, sharp and clarifying, washed over Alistair. The official story, the one he had forced himself to accept to simply survive the grief, shattered into a million pieces. This book wasn't a belonging she'd lost. It was evidence she'd gathered. Brenna hadn't wandered off. She had been led. And Alistair, a journalist who had spent his career chasing other people's truths, realized he had failed to chase the most important one of all. He looked up at Deputy Miller, whose face was a blank slate of professional neutrality. "I need a copy of every single page of this book," Alistair said, his voice finding a strength he hadn't felt in 5 years. "My sister wasn't lost. She was investigating something." He left the station with a USB drive containing high-resolution scans of every page, the weight of it in his pocket feeling heavier than any camera or notepad he'd ever carried. The 5 years of foggy, aimless grief had burned away, replaced by the white-hot intensity of a singular purpose. He wasn't just Brenna's grieving brother anymore. He was the journalist who was going to finish her story. Back in his small apartment, which had always felt 2 sizes too big since his parents moved away after Brenna's disappearance, Alistair plugged the drive into his laptop. He projected the first annotated page onto his wall, the familiar loops and slants of his sister's script looking alien and urgent. For hours he worked, transcribing her notes into a single document, a pot of stale coffee growing cold beside him. A pattern began to emerge from the chaos of her notes. The references to Blackwood Creek Development were all tied to sections of the manual dealing with parkland boundaries and county zoning laws. She had marked parcel numbers and legal codes. Using his press access to the county's online database, Alistair began looking them up. One by one, the parcels told a story. They were sections of the protected state forest bordering the very park where Brenna had gone camping. Land that, according to records from 6 years ago, was untouchable. Yet newer documents showed they had been quietly rezoned and sold off to a single entity, Blackwood Creek Development, LLC, for a price that was criminally low. It was a classic land fraud scheme, the kind of dry, procedural corruption that rarely made headlines but made a few people very rich. Alistair started digging into the LLC. It was a ghost, a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box with no public-facing partners. It was a dead end, designed to be. But Brenna had found a thread. In the margin of a page detailing officer conduct, she'd written a name, Elias Vance. Okay. Alistair ran the name through the State Bar Association database. Elias Vance was a real estate lawyer based in the state capital, 2 hours away. A quick social media search gave him the connection he needed. On Vance's public profile was a smiling family photo from a recent holiday. Standing next to him, arms slung around his shoulder, was Sheriff Marcus Coleman. The caption read, "Great to have my brother-in-law in town for Christmas." The pieces clicked into place with sickening certainty. The sheriff's brother-in-law sets up a shell company. The sheriff oversees the jurisdiction where public land is being sold. It was blatant. Brenna must have uncovered the same connection. She must have been getting ready to expose them. His next step was clear. He needed to know who else Brenna might have spoken to. He scanned the margins of the book again, looking for anything other than legal jargon. Tucked away near the back, on a page about interagency cooperation, was another name. Ranger Thompson, old guard, knows the ridges. It took Alistair a day of calling retired ranger associations to find him. Arthur Thompson was in his late 70s now, living in a small cabin an hour south of the park. When Alistair called and introduced himself as Brenna Calloway's brother, the old man was silent for a long moment. "I was wondering if anyone would ever call," Arthur finally said, his voice raspy. "I can't talk about it on the phone. If you want to know what I know, you have to come see me." The drive to Arthur's cabin was tense. Alistair felt like he was moving through a dream, retracing the steps his sister had taken 5 years ago. The old ranger lived simply, surrounded by towering pines and the smell of wood smoke. He was a small, wiry man with eyes that had seen decades of seasons change in the mountains. He listened patiently as Alistair laid out what he had found: the book, the land deal, the connection to the sheriff. Arthur nodded slowly, staring into the crackling fire in his hearth. "Your sister was smart," he said, "and she was brave. Too brave, maybe." He explained that Brenna had come to him a few weeks before she disappeared. She'd been asking questions about the new survey markers that had appeared deep in the forest in protected zones. "I told her it was the sheriff's business," Arthur continued, his gaze distant. "Coleman had started taking a personal interest in patrolling that northern ridge. Said it was about cracking down on illegal hunting, but it never sat right with me. He was always meeting men up there, suits and fancy trucks who didn't look like they belonged in the woods. They'd use the old hunter's cabin off the East Trail." Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. "A hunting cabin?" "Yeah. It's been abandoned for years, but Coleman kept the key, claimed it was for departmental use." Arthur leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The day your sister went missing, I was on patrol near the falls. I heard something." "What did you hear?" "Two sounds, like a truck backfiring maybe, but it was sharp, echoed through the valley. Sounded an awful lot like gunshots." Arthur looked Alistair directly in the eye, his own filled with a deep, ancient regret. "I never told the police. When the sheriff himself is the one asking the questions, you learn to keep your mouth shut, especially when you've got a pension to protect. I'm ashamed of it, son. But I was scared." 2 gunshots. The official search and rescue report had mentioned nothing about gunshots. They had painted a picture of a quiet, peaceful forest that had simply swallowed his sister whole. It was all a lie. The hiking accident, the fruitless search, the sympathetic sheriff. A carefully constructed narrative to hide the truth. The final piece of the puzzle was the hunting cabin. Alistair knew he had to go there. Arthur drew him a map on a napkin, marking the overgrown trail that led to it, a path not found on any official park map. Before Alistair left, he decided to make one more stop. He had to face the man at the center of it all. He drove back to town and walked into the sheriff's department, his nerves coiled tight. He told the receptionist he was a journalist doing a follow-up piece on unsolved disappearances in the region. Sheriff Coleman agreed to see him. He was just as Alistair remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a politician's easy smile and handshake. He offered Alistair a coffee and listened with feigned interest. "The Calloway case," Coleman said, leaning back in his leather chair, the picture of authority. "A real tragedy. We searched for 2 weeks straight. Hard on the whole community. Hard on me personally." "You found no evidence of foul play?" Alistair asked, keeping his voice steady. Coleman's smile tightened just a fraction. "None. She just vanished. The wilderness, it can be unforgiving." He looked at Alistair, his eyes holding a veiled warning. "It's best not to go stirring up old ghosts, son. All it does is bring back the pain for the family. You should let sleeping dogs lie." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear. Alistair left the station with his heart pounding. The sheriff knew. He didn't know how much Alistair knew, but he knew he was digging. The race was on. The next morning, under the cover of a gray, overcast sky, Alistair parked his car in a hidden turnoff Arthur had marked on the map. He had a backpack with water, a flashlight, and a camera. The trail to the cabin was barely visible, a faint path choked with weeds and fallen branches. For over an hour, he pushed his way through the dense undergrowth, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. Finally, he saw it. The cabin was a dilapidated structure, its wood gray and rotting, its roof sagging in the middle. The door was secured with a heavy, rust-covered padlock. But the wood around the lock was splintered, and with a firm push, the door groaned open. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. A single room held a rotting table, a broken chair, and an old wood stove. Alistair's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing across the grimy floor. He searched everywhere, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been here in years. He felt a wave of disappointment. Had he come all this way for nothing? He was about to leave when his foot caught on an uneven section of the floor. He pointed his light down. One of the floorboards was slightly raised. His heart leaped. Using his pocket knife, he pried at the edge. The board came up with a screech of rusty nails. He shone his light into the dark space beneath. It was mostly filled with dirt and cobwebs, but something small and metallic glinted in the beam. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a spent shell casing, tarnished with age but unmistakable. He turned it over in his palm. It was a .40 caliber, the standard issue for Sheriff Coleman's department. This was it. This was the physical proof that connected the gunshots Arthur heard to the sheriff. This was what they had missed. He carefully placed the casing in an evidence bag he'd brought, his mind racing. He had the motive, he had the witness to the gunshots, and now he had the casing. He had the whole story. As he stood up, ready to hike back to his car and take this to the state police, a shadow fell across the cabin's doorway. Alistair spun around, his blood running cold. Sheriff Coleman stood there, blocking the only exit. His friendly smile was gone, replaced by a cold, flat expression. "Letting sleeping dogs lie," the sheriff said, his voice dangerously calm. "I believe that was my advice." He took a step into the cabin, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his side. The door swung shut behind him, plunging the small room into near darkness, trapping them both inside with a 5-year-old secret. "You've been a busy man, Mr. Calloway," Coleman said, his voice echoing in the small, dark space. Alistair's mind raced, his hand tightening around the evidence bag in his pocket. The cabin felt like a tomb. "My sister found out about the Blackwood Creek deal, didn't she?" Alistair said, his voice surprisingly steady. He needed to keep him talking. Coleman let out a short, humorless laugh. "She was relentless, I'll give her that. A real bulldog. Just like her brother." He took another slow step forward. "She found the paperwork, the connection to my brother-in-law. She brought it all to me. Right here." in this cabin. She thought she could appeal to my conscience, get me to do the right thing. And you killed her for it, Alistair stated, the words tasting like poison. It was an accident, the sheriff snapped, his composure finally breaking. She wouldn't listen to reason. I offered her money, a chance to walk away. But she was going to expose everything, ruin me, ruin my family. We argued. She tried to run. He gestured vaguely toward the woods outside. There was a struggle. The gun went off, twice. The confession hung in the dusty air, raw and ugly. Coleman's eyes darted to the raised floorboard, then to the bulge in Alistair's pocket. He knew. Give me the casing, Alistair, he said, his voice dropping low again. And the book. We can say you got lost out here. Just like your sister. Another tragic accident. Alistair knew he wouldn't make it out of the cabin alive. Coleman was going to finish what he started 5 years ago. But he had planned for this. Before he'd left his car, he had opened a call to his editor, leaving the line active and placing the phone in his breast pocket. He could only hope the signal was strong enough and that his editor had understood his coded message about checking on a high-risk source. It's over, Coleman, Alistair said, trying to buy time. You can't cover this up. The sheriff drew his pistol, the click of the safety being released deafeningly loud in the silence. I've kept this secret for 5 years. I can keep it for another 50. Just as he raised the weapon, the distant sound of sirens cut through the forest, faint at first but growing steadily closer. Coleman's head snapped toward the door, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been so sure he was in control. That momentary distraction was all Alistair needed. He lunged, not at the sheriff, but at the rickety table beside him. He shoved it with all his might, sending it crashing into Coleman's legs. The sheriff stumbled, his shot going wide, splintering the wooden wall. Before he could recover, the cabin door burst open and 2 state troopers stormed in, weapons raised. Drop it, Sheriff! Now! Coleman froze, trapped between the troopers and Alistair. The fight drained out of him, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The pistol clattered to the floor. As the troopers cuffed him, Coleman's eyes found Alistair's. They were filled not with remorse, but with a bitter, bottomless rage. The rage of a man whose perfect crime had been unraveled by a determined brother in a book that wouldn't stay buried. With Coleman's full confession, the state police found where he had buried Brenna. It was a shallow grave, hidden in a thicket of thorns less than a quarter mile from the cabin. Alistair was there when they found her, a silent witness to the end of a long and painful journey. He had found his sister. He had found the truth. He wrote the story. It was the hardest thing he'd ever written, but also the most important. It ran on the front page, a detailed account of Sheriff Coleman's corruption, Brenna's brave investigation, and the 5-year cover-up. The town was rocked by the scandal, but for Alistair, it was the final act of a promise he never knew he'd made. A few months later, on a clear autumn day, Alistair went back to the Northridge campsite one last time. He stood by the river, the water flowing peacefully, no longer holding any secrets. The grief was still there, a familiar ache in his heart. But it was different now. The jagged edges of uncertainty and anger had been worn smooth, replaced by a quiet pride. His sister, the activist, had fought for the truth, and in the end, the truth had won. She hadn't just been a victim who wandered off trail. She was a hero who had followed one. Do you think Alistair could have found the truth without the lucky break of the fisherman finding the book? Or do some secrets need a little push from fate to come to light? If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community. We explore cases like this every week because we believe every story deserves to be told.